tell you another fun fact. Yellowstone National Park was named after my grandfather. No, I made that up. That's not true. That's not true at all. But now you will not forget park without the S. So, I have a doctor's note for a cane. It's a long story, but for a Teddy Roosevelt lecture, it's very, very appropriate. He said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Nice thing about having a cane is when you have a cane, you never have to say to a student, "I'm in charge." It's just assumed. Now, with you all, I don't have to worry about that. Thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night. That is so wonderful of you all. We are going to be talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm going to explain to you why Teddy Roosevelt is top 4 greatest presidents of all time in my book, and why he is the president we need today. And I think by the end of this lecture, you will agree that he is the president we need today. Because he helped guide the United States through an economic and technological revolution that was changing everything about society and leading to a lot of problems, but he didn't take a simple solution to it. So first I'm going to tell you about the 2 economic revolutions. Then I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to give you the context for why he was the right man at the right place at the right time. And then after that, I'll tell you about Teddy Roosevelt, his background, his personal life, and what he did as a politician, as a president. And then I'll tell you why it is so relevant today. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any point. I don't get flustered if you stop me in the middle of a lecture. Without further ado, though, Teddy Roosevelt. Taming the revolutions. Now, the period we're looking at is the late 1800s. Revolutions, we usually think of them as military revolutions, violent revolutions. But the most impactful revolutions are the economic ones. Those are the ones that change everything about everyone's life. And one of the largest in all of human history, arguably the largest in terms of how much it changed people's lives, was the Second Industrial Revolution. The period that we're talking about is called the Gilded Age. Gilded Age lasted roughly from the 1870s to 1900. In that 30-year period, the United States will go from being a predominantly rural, slow-moving, agricultural-based economy to becoming the manufacturing economic giant it has been ever since. Since the 1870s, the United States has been the economic superpower of the world, bar none. And it has remained that way ever since. Does anyone know where the term Gilded Age comes from? Well, you're a historian. Hey, yes, keep your dad in line. Would you like my stick? Does any non-historian? Yes, Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote a book called The Gilded Age to describe the time. Mark Twain is one of those brilliant minds who could accurately understand the period he lives in. Most people don't, it's not until hindsight they can understand, but he understood the period he lived in. And he wrote a book about this, and if you've read it, he is very critical of the period. He is very, very critical. Does anyone know what gilded means? Put it in gold. So, you have a dog, you're taking your dog for a walk, your dog does its business, you pick up its business, dip it in gold, that is a gilded piece of shit. What happens if you scratch off the top layer of that? Same thing underneath. That's what he was saying. May look beautiful on the outside, may be pretty, but underneath, it's all ugly. Now, He probably went a little bit too far because he loved the outdoors, Mark Twain. He probably went too far in his criticism of it. But the Second Industrial Revolution, it did change everything. Everyone's life was profoundly changed in ways that are just immeasurable. And there's so much that can be said about this. I'll just give a couple quick, like random facts about how much things changed. Before the 1870s, women on average spent about 6 hours a day on clothes. Mending clothes, fixing clothes. After the 1870s, they did not. That is a huge difference if you are, obviously if that's your job. From Jesus of Nazareth till Thomas Jefferson, there was no mode of transportation that was any faster than a horse. And then after Thomas Jefferson, you started getting faster and faster modes of transportation. During this period, we get the beginning of, well, we get railroads en masse, but we also start getting beginning of planes. And if you imagine from this period where we are today, it's just so much change taking place. One of the key factors in all this was the rise of corporations. We had never seen this before. Corporations are large companies that have thousands and thousands of people and a pyramid structure. There's one person at the top. They have thousands of people working for them. And this had never existed. One of the novel things of this entire period, and that will dominate this period, are these large corporations. And there was nothing restricting them because we had never seen them. That's why there would be a few people that will dominate this entire period. The very first corporation was a railroad company. That railroad company is the very first, what we'd consider corporation or big business. And they proliferated throughout the United States, and they are responsible for all the other growth that happened. Take a look at this map. That's the amount of land and money given to those railroads to build was somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million in cash grants to these companies and $300 million in land. They're just given tons of money. If you want to know the height of corruption during this period occurred with railroads and this land grants. Some of the biggest political scandal involved this. These companies that were able to dominate these entire industries were all controlled by one person. Not all of them one, but we'd have entire industries, I should say, that were controlled by one person. And so during this period, the robber barons, as they're called, became infamous. Andrew Carnegie, steel, provided the backbone for the railroads. He created U.S. Steel. The United States will outproduce England, France, Germany, and Italy in steel output by 1900. J.P. Morgan, the most important financier during this period. He was an investment banker. He'd buy up a lot of other companies, and he would have control of them. He effectively was the central bank for the United States until we created the Federal Reserve in 1913. He single-handedly will get the United States out of 2 economic collapses. He served as the central bank for the country. That's how powerful he was. He would buy up majority stocks in all sorts of other companies, so he had his hand in every other business. He also was the one that bought up U.S. Steel in 1901, so he will own steel. The first person to ever have electricity in his house. Can anyone guess why? He funded Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison's company, he was the one that funded it, so he's the first private residence to have electricity. So he will have his hand in every business. Keep that in mind. John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil. He will control 95% of all oil refineries in the United States. The first billionaire in U.S. history. He was the richest American of all time 5 years ago. I don't know if that's true anymore. I have not had the chance to look it up, but controlled everything that had to do with oil. You could not compete against him. These people, they dominated their entire industries, and they are called robber barons because in the medieval period, robber barons were people that owned land, and then they would charge anyone to even walk across their land. Now, some people call them industrial statesmen because they were good businessmen. Make no mistake about that. It's not like they got all of their power and their wealth through corrupt means. But every one of them did things that today are illegal, even in their own time, were immoral, considered unethical. But there were no laws against doing what they were doing because we had never seen them before. So the debate between whether they are robber barons or just criminals or industrial statesmen pretty much depends on your political ideology and where you stand. For a long time, people said they made the Gilded Age, and that's not accurate. The Gilded Age made them. The Gilded Age, unregulated economy, allowed them to accumulate enormous amount of wealth and power. And so it was the period that, the novelty of it all, that allowed them to thrive and monopolize entire industries. Now, there's some people that, like Mark Twain, that said all of this was terrible. And to this day, there are people that hate everything about the Gilded Age. But I think we can all, most of us today can agree that it is a good thing this happened. There are a lot of positives that came from this. For example, productivity. Before 1870, if you lived in, say, rural Montana, and there was a drought, you could starve to death. After the 1870s, we mass-produced everything, including food. So now, all of a sudden, if you have a drought, there's a railroad that comes to your town, you can just buy the food. So the amount of goods being produced rose enormously, and people's, which meant the cost of everything went down, so people's lives got better, demonstrably better. Mattress to sleep on in 1865 cost around like $30, which that is a huge amount of money back then. People slept on hay, and if you've ever worked with hay, oh, it's miserable. By the 1901, you could get a mattress for like $2, so it meant higher standard of living. This is when you get Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, the original Amazon. They would send out these huge pamphlets of like 1,000 pages. You could order everything from these things. And if you had a railroad going through your town, now you had access to things that you never would have before, which means everyone's standard of living is going to go up a bit. Everyone has more options. And so people's lives got better. Third, power. It's better to live in the world economic superpower than not. I think most people can agree with that. Those large corporations, if you're going to be a world superpower, you need to have large corporations. Let's say today Amazon decided they're going to leave the United States. What country would accept them? If they said, we're looking for a new country, any of them, literally any of them, they would be falling all over themselves to accept them. So as much as we can criticize corporations, and there are things to criticize, we'd rather have them than not have them. And also the United States, it is the most charitable country in human history. The United States, Americans give more to philanthropy. Those robber barons, John D. Rockefeller gave away half of his wealth, more than $500 million. He helped build up colleges, Rockefeller Center, Carnegie Hall. They built these massive monuments and that have lasted. And so they gave a lot of their money away. great irony is they gave so much money away, but they weren't willing to help their own workers. They were willing to build monuments to themselves that would stand up over time, but they wouldn't make their workers' lives just a little bit better. That they fought tooth and nail against.
Where did the Vanderbilts fall in with that group?
Vanderbilts were they were ostentatious wealth, you would call them. They were robber barons, but
And then when they fell in that group. Because I think of, when you were talking about that, I think if you've ever been to New York, I mean, those names are everywhere.
yeah.
You know, and it's great that they donated it because it's incredible monuments to that.
It is. It is. It is. It is, and I'm not at all diminishing them giving these huge amounts of money, but it is somewhat self-aggrandizing. Just to make a contemporary comparison, Jeff Bezos built a spaceship, sent a spaceship up. I saw an interview with Jeff Bezos, and a reporter asked, why are you getting into space travel? And his response to a journalist that he knew was going to be published was, well, what else am I going to do with this money? And you're just like, Jeff. I've seen what it's like working in Amazon factories. How about just a little bit better working conditions? A little bit. I'm not saying give them everything, just make people's lives a tiny bit better in your own time. And so, not diminishing what they did great things, but they did things that were going to make them, they're building pyramids to themselves. I think it's fair to say. With the good, of course, came problems. There were a lot of problems that came with industrialization and urbanization, such as ruin of the environment. There are no environmental laws, so the amount of pollution was enormous. So many examples, but the river that John D. Rockefeller's first oil refinery was on, the Cuyahoga River, they just dumped oil into it to the extent that in the 1960s, it actually caught on fire. Just so you know, it is chemically impossible to set water on fire. But the river itself caught on fire. That is a person dipping his hand in the water. Most people can agree that we do not want to have companies just dumping their oil in the water like that. But there's no laws against it. Another problem was extremes in wealth and poverty. And the extremes were massive. The average factory worker at the time made $490 a year. Today, that would be $18,907. That is for a man who has a wife and on average 3 kids. Can anyone live on $19,000 a year? No, it's not possible. That's the average worker. At the same time, John D. Rockefeller was making almost $2 billion a year. Today's dollars. Is John D. Rockefeller worth more than his average worker? Of course he is. Should he be paid more? Of course he should. How much more? So extremes in wealth and poverty, that was a big one. And abuse of workers. The United States was the only industrialized nation in the world that did not have any workers' compensation laws. If you were injured on the job, or you died on the job, then you got nothing. If you lost an arm at work, do you know what you got? Fired, because you only have one arm. If you died, do you and your family got? Nothing. Without any workers' compensation laws, as you would imagine, the United States had the highest rate of deaths and disability of any country in the world per capita. The numbers vary, but what's called roughneck work, that's dangerous jobs, something like 1 in 6 workers were either seriously injured or killed every year. 1 in 6 in some professions. The number of Americans who were seriously disabled every year was more than 1 million. The number that were killed on the job was more than 300,000. Or not, more than, the number that was killed was more than 30,000. It varied year by year. Workers were abused because there's no reason, there's no incentive for a company to not abuse them, to not treat them however they wanted to. There's no child labor laws. This kid right here is 5 years old in St. Louis, Missouri. He works an 8-hour day, 8 to 10 hour day selling newspapers. He is 3'5" tall. My nephew is 5 years old. Can you imagine just sending a 5-year-old out into the street? See you at dinner? Just so you know, a teenager, that's a 20th century invention. Before this, you were baby, child, adult. Coal mines were the worst. Kids have really small hands, so they were able to sift through the coal and the rock and do that for, 8, 10 hours a day. Once you had done it long enough, you were promoted to that kid right there. His job, I don't know what it is about 8-year-olds, but when they've been working 10 hours a day, they get tired and they start falling asleep, so they'd have kids stand up there and make sure that they stay awake by giving them a good whack. That is their life. What chance do they have? Another problem, political corruption. The Gilded Age is known for the amount of corruption in politics, and for one very simple reason: money. If you went to the United States Senate at the time, then you could pick out each senator by which corporation, which industry owned them. That is a steel senator. That is an oil senator. You knew which congressperson, which senator was owned by which company. That is how corrupt this period is. Can anyone tell me President of the Gilded Age? Between 1865, Abraham Lincoln, and 1900, Teddy Roosevelt, there is no significant presidents, there are no presidents that did great things. They weren't all insanely corrupt. Presidents weren't, but none of them did anything great. Can anyone name any president after Grant? Between Teddy Roosevelt? McKinley. What? Johnson was before Grant. Yeah, McKinley. Yes, McKinley. He'll be killed. We'll get to him. Yes. They're all Civil War veterans, and they were all very pro-business, and they all did practically nothing. Very, very little. You will not find one that did anything great. The best president was Grover Cleveland, the only Democrat. We only had 2 Democrats before Abraham Lincoln and FDR, and Grover Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms before Donald Trump. Grover Cleveland was the greatest president of the Gilded Age because he didn't waste or steal money. He didn't do anything great. He just didn't waste or steal money. That's why he's called the greatest president of the Gilded Age. So we did not have great leadership because of the predominant political philosophy of the time that was espoused by all the political leaders, laissez-faire. That is the dominant philosophy that everyone talked about. It's a French word. It means to leave or to let alone. Government should not do anything to regulate any corporation and shouldn't do anything to help individuals. So this was the dominant idea of the time. Laissez-faire. Do we have any political philosophy like that today? The government does nothing. Libertarian. The libertarian is the closest. I know a lot of people that say they're libertarians, and you give me 5 minutes, and most people aren't actually. They say, I'm a libertarian, but I want really big military, and I want the government to... Most people want a big government in certain ways, but that is true libertarian. Government does nothing. And that was a dominant philosophy, and that's what happened. This sounds neutral, doesn't it? If government doesn't do anything, then it's fair, right? Unless you are those large corporations that get control, and then what do large corporations do? Buy politicians, and then get whatever laws they want passed. And that's what happened. The biggest issue for a lot of people was the monopoly abuses. When you have someone that owns 95% of all oil manufacturing, they can do whatever they want, and they did. These monopolies, they have such unchecked power that for a lot of people, that was the root problem, was those monopolies that were abusing people. So there were a lot of problems that came along with it. Now, what exactly happened in terms of politics? And I promise you, we're getting to Teddy Roosevelt. In order to understand why Teddy Roosevelt was so great, you have to understand what came before him. And in terms of the politics of the Gilded Age, very little happened. Like for the amount of change and growth that happened during this period, it's remarkable how little was done politically. There were a few accomplishments of note for our purposes. Well, I know this is it's a Monday night, 6 p.m. I don't want to shock anyone, but back then, part of the problem was the level of partisanship. Parties did not care about solving things, they just cared about fighting against each other. I know, I know. Back then they were monsters. Thank goodness that we've progressed so much further, yes. But if you can imagine yourself in some barbaric period where the parties would rather fight against each other than actually have meaningful solutions, that's what it was like back then. And it was just two parties were fairly evenly divided, so they just spent all their time fighting against each other and getting their supporters to fight against each other. And they were very effective at that. And it was scary how much they manipulated their own voting population. And it's even scarier how easily humans are manipulated by this stuff, by tribalism. It's a random fun fact for you. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, they would bring in black workers from the South because white and black workers would not unionize. They would bring in black workers and they're like, good, well now, it's easy. Humans are easy to manipulate on race, ethnicity, and religion. Today, gender. Like, it's the simple thing. Rich people, the very rich and powerful, they will divide the population on tribalism and then extract the wealth. It's very, very formulaic and has been done all throughout history. So very, very little was done. A couple pieces of legislation that are important. One, we actually dealt with the spoil system. If you know anything about U.S. history, spoil system was started by Andrew Jackson. Spoil system is a process by which presidents remove people from non-policy making positions because they don't support them politically. And it's very important, non-policy making positions. I've known people with their PhDs that get this wrong. It does not include cabinet level positions. They make policy. We're talking about during this time, during Jackson's time, tax collectors and mailmen. President comes in and they would fire mailmen just because those mailmen did not support them politically. They would fire ones who were the opposing party, but then they'd fire ones who were just not supportive. It made the United States political system completely dysfunctional. Before Andrew Jackson, the European countries would send people to the United States to see how well our government was run. After Jackson started the spoil system, the United States became a national and international laughingstock. People ran for office just to give out government jobs. It was one of the main things that presidents spent their time on, is just giving out jobs to their party and their supporters. Well, they dealt with that during the Gilded Age because we had a president assassinated over it. James A. Garfield, 1880, one of the very few presidential assassinations where there's not a conspiracy theory. Because the gunman shot him, stood over the body and said, that's because I didn't get my government job. And so we decided as a country, all right, maybe we should deal with this. So we get the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. This said that people would be hired based on standardized test and merit, and they could not be removed for political reasons. It had to be for cause. When it was first passed, It covered about 15% of federal jobs, and as of 2024, it was about 90% of federal jobs. You have to take a test. If you've ever talked to someone that's a mailman, it is a very intense test. That is a byproduct of this. So that is one thing that was done. Protective tariff, that was a huge issue. I've had students that write evaluations saying, I'd never seen someone so excited talking about tariffs. That's it. And it's not that I'm excited talking about tariffs, but before the first progressive income tax, the number one source of federal revenue of the US government was protective tariff. That is why people obsessed about it. The tariff is a way to protect US companies. Is the tariff compatible with laissez-faire? No. Protective tariff makes things more expensive for average Americans, and it helps companies. That's the way it's always functioned. It's the way it's supposed to function. It helps one very small, really rich group of people. And so, but remember, they said laissez-faire unless you're helping a company. Then railroads can have all the land they want, and we'll have tariffs. So laissez-faire, it's a philosophy, but it wasn't evenly practiced. Someone asked the president, well, things we're buying is more expensive. The coats were with the tariff. This is a response. A cheaper coat means a cheaper man or woman underneath that coat. If anyone can explain what the hell that means, please tell me, because my brain is not, I'm not smart enough. I have no idea what that means, but that was his argument for why we needed a tariff.
Said by somebody who's rich.
Yeah. Well, if they're rich, they must know what they're doing. There was also an attempt to deal with the monopoly abuses. And there will be a couple things done to deal with the monopoly abuses because those large corporations were doing things that were just so incredibly corrupt that even for the time they upset people. I'll just give you one example that's significant, like railroads. Railroads are a natural monopoly. If you have a railroad going through your town, you have no options except using that railroad, especially if you're a farmer. So farmers, they were barely making a living, and the price of cotton goes up 2 cents. What would the railroad company do that was going through the town? Raise their prices by 2 cents. So the railroad companies would adjust their rates depending on the price of the commodity, and so they destroyed regular farmers' ability to make a living. And there's nothing a farmer could do. They had to use it. So there was such an outcry among farmers that it led to the creation of the very first federal regulatory agency in all of U.S. history, Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC, Interstate Commerce Act, created the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, a three-man commission, a permanent three-man commission that was able to hear complaints from farmers or whoever it was about the changing of prices, and then they could go in, or they could go to the courts and say they've adjusted their price unfairly, and then the courts would rule on whether they needed to change their prices. Sounds great, right? Well, who do you think they put in charge of the three people they put in charge? Well, the three people they put in charge were being paid by railroad companies. And they would look at it and be like, no, I don't think there's anything wrong here. ICC didn't matter at all. Remember, regulatory agencies and laws are only as good as the people that are in charge of them. And so the ICC will not matter for the first few years. But it is the very first federal regulatory agency, permanent federal regulatory agency. And we'll come back to it, so keep that in mind. There was also something done, attempted to be done, with the monopolies. This is the beginning of what are called trusts. The very first one was created by John D. Rockefeller. A trust is, in John D. Rockefeller's case, a 9-man board who would buy up majority stocks in a bunch of other companies. So like John D. Rockefeller, he controlled 95% of all oil manufacturing. It wasn't all called Standard Oil. They all had their own individual names, but he controlled the majority stock in them. And so most people had no idea The amount of paperwork, the amount of headache in just figuring out these existed, it took years. But when the public found out there was such an outcry, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. To this day, we have an antitrust division in the Justice Department, and that is from this act. It said, any corporation company that is in restraint of trade or anything that is in restraint of trade or commerce, keep that phrase in mind, is considered illegal. What does in restraint of trade or commerce mean? Whatever the judge says it means. So, as you would imagine, they had the law, but it was not enforced at first in any way that had any practical effect. Let me just give you one example. After it was passed, there was a lawsuit that was brought against a sugar company, produced 98% of all sugar in the United States. Lawsuit went to the courts, and the courts ruled, no, this isn't a monopoly. 98%. I will save you from reading the text. What they essentially said is, yeah, this involves regulating commerce, but they're not involved in commerce, they're involved in manufacturing. Totally different. They're manufacturing sugar. That's not commerce, which is so idiotic. You can't even, it's amazing. They're able to say this with a straight face and look themselves in the mirror and say, good job. But that was the Gilded Age. So there were attempts. There were some laws passed, but the laws passed were just to shut the population up, to tell them, look, we did the thing, go away. So it was, in general, nothing was done. Now, that will be the big issue for a lot of people, is what do we do with those monopolies at the national level? So there was obviously a lot of other issues, but at the national level, the big question was, what do we do about these? Because they're leading to so many other problems. And in general, there was 4 options for how to deal with them that are actually relevant to this day. One end of the spectrum, laissez-faire. Don't do anything. Laissez-faire is so easy because the answer is don't do anything. You don't have to ask, well, what is the abuse? What is the problem? It doesn't matter. Don't do anything. The other end of the spectrum, socialism. That was popular at the time. Have the federal government take it over, socialize, nationalize industries. There were people that said that. That is the other end of the spectrum. The other 2 options that the debate largely sat around was, 1, antitrust, and that means break up all the companies. And so we have a bunch of small competing companies, and then that will solve the problem. And regulation. Keep the large corporations, but just regulate their abuses. And this is where the big debate lay in how we're going to deal with all these problems. We'll come back to this in a minute. Now, the second revolution, because there's 2 revolutions Roosevelt dealt with. The first, second industrial revolution. The other one is called the revolution of rising expectations. Revolutions don't occur when everyone's doing bad. If you have a country where everyone's poor, it's fine. Revolutions occur when the economy is doing well, when there's a part of the population that's doing well. And it's true of the French Revolution. Even in the 1960s, some of you will remember all the riots that broke out throughout the United States in major cities. They occurred in places where the economy was going up, where there was people doing really well and the economy is moving up, but the reality for a big part of the population did not match the expectation. That is when things are dangerous, is when the economy is doing well, but a part of the population is not experiencing that gap, that wealth. That gap between there, when it gets too big, that's when people start calling for revolutionary things, like socialism. And during this period, there was a record amount of strikes, and there's a record amount of workers protesting, and they all failed spectacularly. I'll just give you one example. One of the most important strikes in all of U.S. history. And a lot of it was inspired because Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto had just come out. And so it put ideas in people's head about socialism, communism. Now, don't go saying that I was arguing for Marxism. There's never been a socialist country that has been effective long-term, ever. It has not existed. So I'm not arguing for it, but the ideas were very influential at the time. And just one example of that represents all other, or how bad workers had it, was the town of Pullman. This was a town owned by one really rich guy named Pullman. He made very fancy sleeper cars, and he owned an entire town. If you worked for him, you had to live in his town. It's outside of Chicago. He controlled all the houses. You couldn't buy the houses. You had to rent from him. You had to go to his store because you couldn't go to a local store close enough. You had to buy electricity from him and other utilities. You could not congregate in groups larger than 5 people. You weren't allowed to have alcohol in the town if you lived in this town. So he controlled them. It was the most similar thing you can imagine to European monarchy. They owned everything. Well, there was an economic collapse in the United States in 1893. It's called the Great Depression, before the Great Depression. When that hit, Pullman fired half the workers, cut the pay by 40% of the remainder of them, but did not change the price of rent and did not change the price of food or electricity. Workers were paid every 2 weeks, and they were getting checks for 2 cents sometimes. They had to shut off their electricity. It was so cold, their kids couldn't go to school. They sat in bed all day with blankets over them. 3 workers went and tried to complain. They were fired on the spot. So the rest of the Pullman workers walked off the job. They were backed by one of the largest unions in the United States, the American Railway Union, headed by a guy named Eugene V. Debs. Debs stepped in and he tried to work out an agreement, but Pullman said, absolutely not, I'm not going to negotiate with them. I will have nothing to do with any union. So Debs said, all right, we're having a strike on all railroads connected to a Pullman car, which is most railroads. The ARU included more than 150,000 members. And so what this meant is it stopped all railroad activity west of the Mississippi River, essentially. 36 states, all commerce just shut down, which meant it was a national crisis. The president at the time, a bunch of railroad executives, they had a really good idea. They started attaching Pullman cars to mail cars. Why is that such a good idea? Now it's a federal issue. Now they're interfering with federal mail, which is you're stopping federal government from doing its job, which is a felony. It went to the courts. The very first time the Sherman Antitrust Act was used in restricted trade or commerce was against the strikers at Pullman. The very first time the Sherman Antitrust Act was effectively used by the courts was against workers. Of the first 13 times it was used effectively, 12 were against strikers, not corporations. They were ordered to not talk about the strike at all, and Debs kept talking about it, and he was thrown in jail. Federal agents were sent across the United States. There were pitched battles in Chicago with railroads tipped over and gunfights over this. And eventually all the workers were forced back to work at bayonet point. It failed completely, totally. The ARU was broken up. Debs ended up in jail. But what we get from this, 2 important things. One, Labor Day. You guys ever wonder, like, why do we get this day off? Even at the time, they're like, wow, that escalated. We really should figure something out. Let's give them a day. There you go. Shut up. Go away. So we got Labor Day. The other thing is, Debs, from his jail cell, he came to the conclusion capitalism will not work because it only works in the favor of corporations. He will found the Socialist Party of America. That is exactly what Marx had said. When capitalism will naturally lead to the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, and they'll abuse the majority until the majority are so sick of it, they want to blow up the system. They call for radical solutions. And Debs will be run as a Socialist Party candidate in 5 different elections. that tells you workers were abused and they were turning to radical solutions, which scared the hell out of some people, most notably Teddy Roosevelt. Any questions so far? These are the two revolutions that Roosevelt was having to deal with at the same time. The problems of industrialization, urbanization, problems of the second industrial revolution, and the problems of the revolution, rising expectations of workers being abused to the extent that they're trying to destroy the system. So Roosevelt, he will be the right man in the right place at the right time to start calling for changes to the system, to deal with both of them. And it is his ability to understand both of these things at the same time and recognize them that makes him so impressive. He's such an interesting person. We are only talking about the domestic side. His foreign policy side, it's a whole other lecture we don't have time for. But he's so interesting. He loved war more than anything else in the world. He thought war was the greatest thing to ever happen to humanity. And he's the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Like actually win it, not just be given it. But he absolutely loved war. Thought it was fun. He was a Roosevelt, so he was born richer than, he wasn't born with a silver spoon. He was born with 12 silver spoons, 14 gold spoons, 8 platinum spoons. His family had so much money, they had no idea where the money came from. So, of course, he homeschooled and had the best tutors. One thing that made him different, though, was from a very early age, it was obvious he was brilliant. And when I say brilliant, I mean, he did one thing that so many amazing people in history do, and that's read obsessively. There's so many people that they seem mediocre and all, or born dirt poor. Abraham Lincoln, Gloria Steinem, terrible birth, but the thing that distinguished them is they read at every opportunity they can. And Roosevelt, well, the same thing. He read every moment, every second he could. And he read nonstop. He was brilliant, but he was also very sickly. He was so sickly, he had asthma, it stopped him from doing a lot of things. So his dad, when he was like 9, sat him down and said, "Look, Theodore, your mind is sharp. You're obviously brilliant. But you cannot be strong unless you make your body strong. Your mind will never accomplish great things without the body. You must have a strong body to have a strong mind." And so he will take on what he called the strenuous life. He played every sport you can imagine. He is the most in-shape president we have ever had, bar none. And he boxed for a lot of his life. He was picked on once, and then he boxed and he learned to fight, and he was really good at it. He boxed until, as governor of New York, he was boxing with someone, and they right hook, it dislocated his left eye. He was never able to see quite right out of his left eye. The doctor said, Teddy, you're governor of New York. You need to stop this. So he gave up boxing and took up judo. He got a brown belt in that. As president, he made a practice every day. He would walk in a straight line with his kids. And no matter what came in front of him, he would keep going straight. River, mountain, whatever. They would go up it. It was their game they played. There's so many good stories. At one point, a French diplomat was with him. And he's walking, and diplomats were told, if the president walks, you have to walk with him, otherwise you're not going to get anything done. So the French diplomat's walking with him. The French diplomat wrote in a letter back to his bosses about the experience, and he said, we were walking for miles and we came to a river, and I thought, oh, thank goodness, we have a break. And then Roosevelt stripped down with his kids and swam across. And in the letter back to his boss, he said, for the honor and glory of France, I stripped down and I swam. But of course, I left my gloves on in case a lady came up, which is a weird body part to want to hide. But I will never claim to understand the French. So he took up a strenuous life, and he loved being strong. He, of course, if you're Roosevelt, you go to Harvard. Now, he was different even as a student because most people of his class they were what you call gentlemen scholars, which means terrible students. If you're that rich, you're going to pass, so they wouldn't do anything. He was different. He was brilliant. A lot of his classmates wanted to dislike him because he was so smart. He would argue with the professors, and he always had something to say. But he was also a phenomenal athlete. He was on the rowing team and all sorts of, and so he was really popular. And he would graduate magna cum laude. And then if you're someone of that class, you of course go to law school, which is what he did. He went to Columbia Law School, but what made him also different was he wasn't interested in law. He was interested in politics. If you were of his class, you don't go into politics. It was considered dirty. You bought politicians, but he wanted to be a politician. And so he entered politics, and he quit law school and entered politics. Oh, so here's his senior thesis. That's a title of his senior thesis. The practicability of equalizing men and women before the law. He will call for women's right to vote. He'll call for women to have equal rights to men, which was insanely radical for the time. He even said women should not have to take men's name when they got married. Radical stuff. When he got into politics, he was quit law school, entered politics. He was the youngest member of the New York Assembly in its history to that point. As a congressman, also, he distinguished himself because he was different in two big ways. First, he was an active Republican. During this period, whenever it was a laissez-faire, he said, no, we need to get stuff done. And as a New York Assemblyman, he will get more laws introduced than anyone in the history of the New York legislature to that time. So he's the youngest member. He also introduced more legislation than anyone up in the history of that assembly to that time. So he was active. The other reason he was different was he actually believed that it's okay to change your mind. If you find new facts and new evidence, then you should readjust your thinking. And he did. He changed his mind on all sorts of things. Most people pick a party, pick an ideology, and they're stuck. Not him. You gave him the evidence, he would look at it, and if he realized, oh, his views were wrong, he would change. And he did on multiple occasions. So he was a very different politician. Now, for Valentine's Day, I have to tell you about the love of his life. While he was at Harvard, a junior, he met the woman that he will fall madly in love with. And I mean, he obsessed about her, Alice Hathaway Lee. He wrote in a journal every single day. And that's what he wrote the day he met her. As long as I live, I shall never forget how sweetly she looked and how prettily she greeted me. He'll court her relentlessly, and he just fawned over her. He'll ask her to marry him, and she waited 8 months before, she asked her to marry him, she waited 8 months before giving him an answer. Apologies, that's way too much text for one thing. But after 8 months, January 25th, she agreed to marry him. At last, everything is settled. I'm so happy. I dare not trust in my own happiness. If loving her with my whole heart and soul can make her happy, she shall be happy. The aim of my whole life shall be to make her happy and to shield her and guard her from every trial. And that's what he did. He adored her. They announced to the world that they were engaged February 14th, 1880. He absolutely adored her, and he did everything that she wanted to make her happy. The level of infatuation that he had for her cannot be described. When he was in the New York Assembly in 1884, he and his wife had their first child, a daughter born on February 12th. He was so excited because it was Lincoln's birthday. February 12th, their first daughter was born. They named their daughter Alice, kissed the baby, and then he went back to the New York Assembly. At that time, his mother lived with them, so he actually had someone watching out. And he was in the New York Assembly, and February 14th, 1884, he got a message, "Come back. There's death in this house." 3 o'clock in the morning, his mother died. He adored his mother. 11 hours later, his wife died. Complications of childbirth. His wife and mother in one day. That's the journal entry for that day. He wrote so much every day, and on that day is just a big black X. The light has gone out of my life. He was so heartbroken. Even in his autobiography, he did not mention her name. The rest of his life, no one ever spoke about Alice in front of him, or he would just shut down. It hurt so bad. He'll remarry later and have more kids, but even his second wife knew that she was not the love of his life. The love of his life was gone. His daughter Alice, he never once referred to her by name. It was always Baby Lee or some sort of other name, but he could not say her name. That's when he gave up everything, went west, and became an actual cowboy. They went to the Badlands, and the stories of him out in the Dakotas are amazing. Whole books have been written about that too. He went out to the Badlands, became a cowboy, and he actually was a legitimate cowboy. Very Batman story. He did that for 4 years, and he did a phenomenal job. He met a lot of amazing people, did a lot of amazing things, and then after several years out in the Badlands, a big storm wiped out all of his cattle, and he came back to New York to clean it up, just like Batman. Because of that, he always loved the outdoors. It's one of my favorite pictures of him. He looks like a child. He came back to New York. He was made chief of police, and he was a different kind of chief of police because he believed that all laws needed to be followed. Mostly what he did as chief of police was not police criminals, he policed the police. He said, we represent the people, and he believed that the police should be held to a higher standard than the rest of the population because they had the power. So he'd walk the beat every night and not looking for criminals. He would let criminals do their thing. He would find police that were breaking the law. He found one police officer that was in a bar getting drunk, hit him in the back of the head. The guy woke up in a prison cell. He took the most corrupt police system in the United States and he cleaned it up, and he got nationally famous for it. So famous that when Jacob Riis, a muckraker, worked with Roosevelt very closely to clean up New York City. He did such a good job at it that when William McKinley ran for president in 1896, Roosevelt was so popular he was made Assistant Secretary of the Navy. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he will build up the U.S. Navy. And he did such a good job at that. He did such a good job. This slide's in the wrong place, apologies. That's election in 1900. He did such a good job at building up the Navy that he will help start the Spanish-American War. Will help the United States be prepared for it. And that's when he quit the Secretary of the Navy position, joined the Rough Riders, and became a genuine war hero. And he was a war hero, if you look at his record. Made him nationally famous, which meant when he got back to New York, he was a hero. And they elected him governor of New York. As governor of New York, he did the same thing he did as police chief, and he cleaned up the politics in the state. He did such a phenomenal job that he made the Republican Party actually start changing laws to make the system more equitable. And Roosevelt did such a good job that he pissed off the Republican leaders. There were Republican Party bosses, one of the most famous, a guy named Platt, that he worked with very closely. And Platt was so pissed off, Platt said, we need to get this guy out of here. He is ruining my business. He's ruining my power. How do you get the most famous politician in the country out of your state, what can you possibly do to get rid of a governor without killing him? Well, you don't want to be president.
Make him vice president.
Make a vice president, the most worthless job in the United States. That's why in the election of 1900, William McKinley's running again at the Republican convention. Platt made it so Roosevelt was nominated for vice president. The entire place voted unanimously for Roosevelt to be vice president, and there was one dissenting voice in the auditorium. Roosevelt. Roosevelt's like, no, don't want it, it's a junk position. But that's how he became vice president of the United States. Someone actually mentioned to Platt, you know that nutcase is going to be one heartbeat away from the president. And he was told, yeah, but don't worry, vice president, they don't do anything, it's fine. Which, of course, it was not. McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by an anarchist. Roosevelt became president of the United States. Fun fact for you, and make sure you know this because I've seen this on Jeopardy. The youngest person to ever be president is Teddy Roosevelt. The youngest person elected president is JFK. Roosevelt would be elected again in 1904, but by that time he was older than JFK was when JFK was elected. So I've seen that on Jeopardy, so when you win money, remember me and send me a check for part of your winnings. Yeah. Now, what's really important is Roosevelt, he loved power. He loved power, he loved strength, he loved corporations. He loved the power they brought the United States. But he also loved responsibility. He believed if you had power, you had to be responsible with it. He was an aristocrat, old money. Old money tends to be less, they don't flaunt it as much. And so he wanted power, but he wanted the power to be held responsibly. What he hated were the plutocrats, the new rich, the ones that were ostentatious about it, the ones that made it very clear they were breaking the law, like Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was interviewed by a journalist, and he was breaking some law. And he said to the journalist, knowing it was going to be published, law, what do I care about the law? And I got the power? Roosevelt hated that kind of stuff. Roosevelt hated extremes. He hated socialism, obviously, but he hated laissez-faire because laissez-faire was leading to socialism. It was leading to people being abused. It was leading to people realizing the system was unfair to the majority of the population. And so he will reject laissez-faire in order to avoid socialism, to avoid the other extreme. And he made it very clear, he said this over and over again, if the reactionary meant reactionary, that's laissez-faire, no government, do anything. If the reactionary man who thinks of nothing but the rights of property could have his way, he would bring about a revolution. He'll call for more regulation, and people called him radical all the time because of what he would call for. And he had to say over and over again, I am not a radical. What I've advocated is not wild radicalism, it is the highest and wisest kind of conservatism. He called himself an enlightened conservative. I want to conserve capitalism and representative democracy. The way to do that is to change the system a little bit to make it more fair to more people. That is how you fix radicalism. That's how you get rid of radicalism. And so that is what he will do as president. And he will say very publicly in his first address to the Senate or the Congress, antitrust is the wrong thing. We don't want to break up the corporations. We want them. So he said very explicitly, antitrust is the wrong thing to do. We just want to regulate. And then, within 3 months of that, he brought an antitrust suit against a railroad company. They owned all the railroads from Chicago out to Seattle. It was called the Northern Securities Company. Now, if you followed the paperwork up, anyone want to guess who owned the Northern Securities Company? J.P. Morgan. Morgan sent a message that, hey, I'm going to send my guy, you get your guy, we'll work this out outside the courts. Roosevelt said, nope. He brought the lawsuit and broke it up. He will bring 44 antitrust suits in his presidency, earning him the nickname the Trust Buster. And people loved it. Well, why was he doing this? He said he was against breaking up trusts. Well, for one, businesses didn't want to be regulated, and he was telling the businesses, don't fight me on this. Accept what I'm doing. So he was sending a message to businesses. Second, presidents can't pass laws. I know we're living in a period where executive action does everything, but presidents can't pass regulations, so you can only enforce the laws on the books. So he's enforcing the law that he could, which is the antitrust law. Telling his own party, you better accept what I am doing, otherwise I'm going to do more of this. And third, the public loved it. Americans loved what he was doing. And so he brought 44 antitrust suits over the course of his presidency and earned him the nickname Trust Buster. The other thing he did during his first administration, I'll do one other thing worth note. A coal strike. There was a big coal strike that happened that provided coal for the entire northeastern United States. Workers went on strike, and the owners of the mine, they handled it as bad as you could possibly imagine. It's the representative for the mine. Someone asked, don't you care that workers are suffering? That's what he said to a journalist that made it in the newspaper. Suffer? They don't suffer. They can't even speak English. This is the type of stuff that pisses people off. Roosevelt was so mad. He said, the owners of the mine told Roosevelt, look, you send the military in and get this under control. Like with all the other strikes. Roosevelt went to a journalist, went to the public and said very publicly, I'm going to send in the military. We're going to take over that mine and we're going to run it for the United States government. Now, if you follow the anthracite coal mine up the paperwork, anyone want to guess who owned it? J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan said, oh, for God's sake, get something done. So the owners of the mine, they had to go to Roosevelt like, hey, buddy, pal, can you help us with this? So he actually managed to mediate. And very importantly, when he mediated, he had a fair deal for both the workers and the company. He gave both sides exactly half. You know it was a fair deal because both sides thought they were screwed. But he gave exactly half to both sides. It is the first time in all of U.S. history a president did not come down on the side of business. You can't say he gave workers everything they wanted, but he didn't come down on the side of business completely. The very first time that happened, it showed he was a different kind of president. When it came to the election of 1904, he was really excited. This is his chance to actually win in his own right. Roosevelt is the very first, Roosevelt in 1904 was now going to run for president. What did I do? He was going to run for president in his own right. He's the first president to have a name for the package of policies he was going to support. The square deal. Does that sound familiar? What does it remind you of? New Deal of his fifth cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He used the square deal on purpose. What's the definition of a square? Equal on all sides. Equal to labor, equal to corporations, equal to consumers, equal to everyone. He used that very clearly, intentionally. One point people were obsessed, like, well, are you for labor or are you for capital? Which side are you on? And it drove him crazy. Speaking to a journalist asked him, which side are you on? I cannot help feeling that the people who have been confused by my action in various labor cases must be of such limited brain power that nothing in the world will make my position clear to them. I wish to give a square deal to every man, and I intend to stand by the capitalist when he is right, and by the laboring man when he is right, and will oppose one if he goes wrong just as fearlessly as I should oppose the other. Most people have a hard time balancing these things, or understanding that they're both valuable. You need both of them. And that's what he will run on. He'll be able to hold these multiple ideas in his head and recognize the value of all of them. He wins overwhelmingly in his own right. And during his presidency, he will enact several pieces of legislation to regulate the economy. These may not seem like much now, but remember, this is from a virtually unregulated system besides the Interstate Commerce Commission. First, the Hepburn Act. This strengthened the ICC. The ICC had not been able to do much, and so he said, we need to strengthen it. Railroad companies were abusing their power, abusing their monopoly. The Hepburn Act said no longer did the ICC have to go to the courts to get a law changed. Now the ICC could tell a railroad company, you have to change your rates. And then the railroad company was responsible for bringing the lawsuit, which a lot of the time the railroad company knew that they had been jacking up their rates unfairly, so they just wouldn't do. So he strengthened the power of the regulatory agency. That's the problem with regulatory agencies, is they all have to be changed and adjusted all the time because companies change all the time. Second, the Pure Food and Drug Act.
So the Hepburn Act affected the ICC, but originally the ICC was manned by the railroad baron. So now did he place his people on the
Yes, yes. Yeah, so he put people in positions that were actually going to enforce them. Remember, if you want to get rid of a regulatory agency or regulations, you don't destroy the agency. You put people in charge of it that don't care about the job, don't believe in the job. He also got passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. Before this, there is no laws in restricting what you put in medicine. That's I've spoke to a libertarian that said, we don't need any of that things. People can make their own choices. You couldn't make your own choices because you had no idea what's in your food. You had no idea what's in your medicine. That's the ICC. One of the most famous medications at the time for women was called Lydia E. Peekham's vegetable compound. It is the most popular medicine for women that were having some sort of a pain. Oh, vegetable compound, that sounds nice. It was 17% alcohol. They would drink it like, well, that pain went away, and I'm in a temporarily good mood. It would wear off, and then she'd have to drink more and more, but it led to a lot of people becoming alcoholics. I like this one. They didn't even try to hide the name. But, when children are crying with toothaches and you give them one of these, it actually got rid of the pain. This just said companies have to actually label their products and they cannot alter the labeling. That is why we have ingredients lists. Does anyone know what is the Pure Food and Drug Act? What happened to it? Food and Drug Administration. FDA, it's around to this day. He also got passed the Meat Inspection Act. One of the most popular books of the time was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It's a book about socialism. If you've ever read it, it's about Lithuanian immigrants who come and the whole book is just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy of what it's like to be in the United States. The last two chapters are just like this insane stuff about why socialism is so great and why if we have socialism, then we all have to work only 6 hours a week and stuff like that. No one ever made it to that part. They all made it to the part where he works in the sausage plant and after hours, when everything closed down, he has to sweep all of the internal organs and the feces and the human limbs in there. Roosevelt read everything and he was reading The Jungle one morning while he was eating breakfast. Sausage. He got to the part where they're sweeping body parts in and he threw the plate across the room, it smashed into the wall, and he said, we're doing an investigation. He sent federal agents out to meatpacking plants to go investigate this. The companies kept saying, look, this is a work of fiction. This isn't real. The Jungle is a work of fiction. Those federal agents, they actually worked in these factories for months. They came back, they reported to Roosevelt and said, yeah, it's fiction. So much worse than the book makes it sound. So we created the Meat Inspection Act, which said federal agents will investigate, or will oversee meat companies. Make sure there's no tainted meat. Do we have anything like this today? Well, I'll tell you. Yes, FSIS, Food Safety Inspection Services. It is another branch of the government that has federal agents in meat places to make sure the meat is not tainted. So it still is around to this day. Now, Roosevelt will want to get a lot more done, but by 1907, his party would not do what he wanted. There's only one other area that he could get something done, and that was in conservation. He loved the outdoors. I and everyone in my family are Eagle Scouts, and I was a Scoutmaster for my younger brother, so outdoors is something that, conservation is something that's very important. But he wasn't just against anything being done in the environment. He just wanted it to be used wisely. So as president, he will take out more land in circulation than anyone before him. Took out 172 million acres as president, along with his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot. They took out 172 million acres and will be responsible for the creation of like 17 national parks and pissed off a lot of people out west, especially ranchers and loggers, but he is responsible for a lot of the national parks. He's the origins of a lot of the national parks. Now, when he left office, the very last thing he did was he sent the U.S. Navy around the world. It's a very Roosevelt thing to do. The U.S. Under his leadership, the United States developed the second largest navy in the world, right behind England. On his last year in office, he sent it around the world on a great trip. It's called the Great White Fleet because they painted it all white and sent it around the world and told countries, we're coming, have a party ready. Why would you paint it white? Is that a good battle color? The worst battle color. It's peacocking. Hey world, we are now a world power, respect us. It's funny, he sent it away. Congress, the person in charge of the Navy, said, I'm not going to pay for this. Roosevelt said, okay. He sent it off and said, well, if you want our Navy back, you're going to have to pay for it. Pissed off the guy in charge of funding the Navy. Roosevelt will leave office, and he went on a world tour. Fun random fact for you, some of you may know. The teddy bear is named after Theodore Roosevelt. It was originally called Teddy's Bear. The toy company was going out of business, and Roosevelt had a great story about saving or not killing a bear because the bear was sick and injured. And he didn't kill the bear, and a cartoon was drawn of it. The toy company was going out of business, and the toy company's main product was stuffed bears. Owner of the toy company said, may I name this after you? He's like, yeah, sure. Called it Teddy's Bear, which is where we get teddy bear. Toy company was about to go out of business, became Ideal Toy Company, one of the biggest toy companies in U.S. history. Another day in the life of Roosevelt. He left the presidency, traveled around the world, killed everything he could. Smithsonian paid him to bring back every species in Africa. The reason we know Bigfoot doesn't exist, Roosevelt didn't kill him. The Pope asked to meet him. He told the Pope no. He was mad at the Pope for some reason. Typical day in the life of Roosevelt. Now, while he was gone, he put his second in charge of command, William Howard Taft. To make a very long story short, Taft was not the person to follow up Roosevelt. Taft has a lot of, will run against William Jennings Bryan. This is the third time Bryan won. Republicans said, vote for Taft in 2008. You can vote for Bryan anytime. Taft will win, handpicked successor, and he holds the distinction of being the largest president in U.S. history, 300 pounds. Taft, to make a long story short, did not do a good job, according to Roosevelt. Which is why Roosevelt will come back. Just to tell you the difference between Roosevelt, he had the mind of a politician. Taft had the mind of a judge. Taft was a great human being, but he was no Roosevelt. And following Roosevelt up was going to be a disaster for anyone. This picture I showed you before, one of William Howard Taft's claim to fame was he was the governor of the Philippines when the U.S. conquered it. Here's Taft on a water buffalo. You cannot tell who is less happy, the water buffalo or Taft. But you can tell both of them are like, I don't want to be here. The comparison is great, isn't it? Well, Roosevelt, he'll decide that Taft was not doing a good job, and so Roosevelt will come back in 1910 and start calling for the government to do more. Taft did not do as much to reform the system as Roosevelt wanted, so Roosevelt will openly challenge him to be the next president again. From 1910 to 1912, he'll challenge his own hand-picked successor and former best friend for the presidency. Taft had the support of the large businesses, and so Taft will end up getting the nomination for the Republicans, which infuriated Roosevelt. So much so that Roosevelt will found the most successful third party in all of U.S. history. We are a two-party system, and Roosevelt found the most successful third party, the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party. And he will call for things that are so far ahead of his time, we will not get them for decades. He called for fixing the political system from the corruption. The fundamental problem with our political system was there's too much money in it. Companies could just buy politicians. He called for women's suffrage, nationwide presidential primaries, secret ballots. He called for direct election of U.S. senators. Everything he called for will eventually pass. He also called for protection for workers, prohibiting child labor, minimum wage working for women, prohibition of night work for women, and an 8-hour workday for women and young people, 1 day rest in 7. Look at this one. The protection of home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through the adoption of a system of social insurance. What is that? Social Security. He's calling for things that are decades ahead of his time to deal with the problems. Now, why the Bull Moose Party? They called themselves the Progressive Bull Moose Party. The reason was he was walking in to give a speech in St. Louis. He didn't realize he had been followed. There was a guy that had been following him from New York. As he was about to walk into the stadium to give a speech, a guy popped out of nowhere with a gun, aimed it, shot it at him. It went through his glasses case. He had his speech folded up and 50 pages, went through that, went into him. People descended on the guy, started beating him. Roosevelt said, "Do not hurt him. Justice will deal with him." Took a few breaths, realized blood wasn't coming out, so it hadn't punctured a lung, and said, "Let me just go tell the people here that I've been shot." He walked into the stadium, said, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I've been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. The bullet is in me now so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." He then spoke for 1 hour and 45 minutes. I stubbed my toe today and I almost canceled this lecture. Roosevelt, he was a man's man. Against him, he's now running a third party against Taft and Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who will call for antitrust and breaking up the companies. That is a 4-way race we have now. Republican Taft, Roosevelt Progressive, Wilson Democrat, and Eugene V. Debs the Socialist. The real contest was between Roosevelt and Wilson. Taft, poor Taft. At one point, William Howard Taft, President of the United States, 300 pounds, was on the back of a train giving a speech. And a journalist said, "Excuse me, Mr. President, what do you think of what President Roosevelt said about, or what do you think about what former President Roosevelt said about you?" And Taft said, "Well, what did he say?" The journalist said the horrible thing that Roosevelt said about him. William Howard Taft, 300-pound President of the United States, sat down on the back of the train, put his face in his hands, and started sobbing in front of all these journalists. He was just out of his league, poor guy. In the end, it led to the election of a Democrat. one of the only 2 Democrats elected in this entire period, Woodrow Wilson. The only time in all of U.S. history a third party has got more of the popular vote than one of the 2 major parties. The only time. The most successful third party, and it is the Roosevelt Party. Now, a lot of people say the progressive era is Woodrow Wilson, but Wilson will enact the things that he said were going to solve all the problems, the antitrust things, and then realize he was wrong, and he'll go on to pass a lot of legislation that Roosevelt had called for. When people say Wilson is responsible for the progressive era, that is incorrect. Roosevelt, at the national level, Roosevelt started it, and Woodrow Wilson will eventually decide Roosevelt was right. We need to regulate these corporations. We can't just break them all up. And so what Wilson does, he had explicitly been against, but he acknowledged essentially that Roosevelt was correct. Passed the Federal Trade Commission, which we have to this day, regulates all businesses, not just railroads. Passed the first Child Labor Act in U.S. history, and the Adamson Act, which created the 8-hour workday. These 2 will be ruled unconstitutional in the 1920s, and then will be passed again in 1938. Now, where does that leave? Why is this so important today? Today we are in an economic and technological revolution that is changing everything about all of our lives. When there's an economic and technological revolution, so we just talked about the second industrial revolution, it always takes society a few years to start dealing with the problems of it. I think on average, some economists, economic historians have said it's about 50 years. We have not dealt with the problems of the internet. The last federal law that was passed protecting individual privacy was in 1988. It said VHS, or companies that are renting VHSs cannot tell what VHS people are looking at. This is the last federal privacy law we've had. We have not dealt with the problems of the internet age, and we're already on to the AI age. We have robber barons, individuals that control way more than any one person should. If anyone knows anything about the revolution in Myanmar, Facebook is responsible for the death of tens of thousands of people. It provided the location of people that were dissidents, and the Myanmar government executed them en masse. That is controlled by one person. Income inequality is at levels higher than we've seen since the Gilded Age. Today, income inequality is so high, most Americans, last I checked, I think it was 56% of Americans cannot get $1,000 in an emergency without opening up a line of credit. The novelty of the 20th century is the middle class. That low income inequality, that is the exception of human history. And among the population, among the U.S. population born after 1980, less than half of them are going to do as well economically as their parents. It's not individual failures, it is a societal failure, it's a systemic failure. And we need someone to guide us through this. We need a Teddy Roosevelt. That is my argument. Thank you for coming. Any questions?
Okay, so DuPont, you know anything
DuPont family.
Yes, up in the east.
What about them?
Well, are they in some of these categories? The dynamite people,
DuPont's, I know they were, so DuPont family, I know they will start the only thing I know about the DuPont family is when Franklin D. Roosevelt is president, there is a group of really rich people that said the New Deal was destroying liberty, called themselves the American Liberty League. It was just a bunch of rich people. It was founded, DuPonts were one of the founders of it. They said we need to get rid of all the New Deal programs. And surprise, surprise, it only had at max 150,000 members. Heads of GM, Ford, DuPont family. That's the only thing I know about them. But
they're the chemical dynamite.
oh, yeah, the robber barons. I don't know much about them.
Dating myself, but when I hear DuPont, I think of Bhopal, India.
Yes, yes, that's that wheat. What are you referencing?
The Bhopal, India,
Yeah.
that's where they had a chemical spill and literally killed thousands of people in their sleep. So back in like 1986.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It was a DuPont factory.
Huh. Any questions about?
So where do you see our economy going based on history, the history of people?
So what's interesting about, so what most historians say, and this is where I differ from most historians will, Winston Churchill said, Americans will always do what's right once they've exhausted every other option. Historically, we don't make big changes until it's a crisis period. And we have not hit our crisis period. Just my area of work, my dissertation, the book I'm writing is about the Great Depression. We're going to have an economic collapse that is going to pale and make the other ones look like a blip. There's too many bubbles. They're too big. I don't know where we go from here. And the thing is, no one else does either. Anyone that tells you they do, that's how you know they're full of shit. Anyone that claims to know that, anyone that claims there's simple answers to anything, or they know where we're headed, is wrong. Because historically, when there's a crisis, the United States, we step up. In the Civil War, Great Depression, World War II, the United States, once we've exhausted all other options, we will do the right thing, historically. But the difference now is we have the arrogance of being the world superpower for as long as we have. In Great Depression, World War II, we were not the military superpower of the world at that time. It's not until after that we were the world superpower. But the United States, we have been the world power so long that we have the arrogance that everyone will do what we want. And when you look at world history, and you look at all the nations that were once superpowers, Spain, England, it does not do them any justice. It doesn't help them to think in arrogant terms. So, I don't know. The arrogance, the belief that we are so powerful we can dictate to the world everything is a dangerous idea that does not have good precedence for other nations. The whole Brexit thing, that was because the people in England wanted to go back to when they were the world superpower. You're like, you stupid little island. Okay, you're this big. Like, you can only be the world superpower in a world where the Navy is the most important thing. We have planes now. Like, and Brexit destroyed their economy. Tell you, super fun fact, if the United States took England as a country, if we adopted them, they would be the 51st state in terms of the distribution of, how is it? Not just GDP, but the average income of the population. they would be behind Mississippi in terms of how bad their economy is for the majority of the people. So the United States, it's a great country, rich country. We have a lot of problems. If we could only solve them in a time of peace, before the crisis, if we could actually proactively work to try to make other people's lives a little bit better, a little bit easier. Well, I'm saying this because Charles has been on my ass all the time about working. I'm just kidding. Charles is great. But it's a messed up system when most people cannot. Last December, we had a record amount of money spent on Christmas. The last number I heard was 36% of that was debt spending, like Klarna. People are using credit cards to pay for rent, pay for utilities, pay for food. That's a sick system. That's the American dream not working. And what happens when the American dream doesn't work? People turn towards radical ideas. So.
Can I ask you, you had credit fees, like the stock market, all of that. There used to be a concept of, until you had your money in your hand, you didn't spend it and all that. Where does that leave with Roosevelt at all in terms of, I guess my question is that debt now is considered normal?
Are you talking about individual debt or national debt?
Probably a little bit of both, but more individual than otherwise. I mean, like Roosevelt, did he have any play with like the stock market or?
No, Roosevelt, he was meticulous with his finances and not being corrupt. He was obsessed with not being corrupt. I mean, he made sure that he did not benefit. I mean, he went through several periods in his life where he had financial problems because he was not willing to do anything that even smacked of possibility of corruption. But yes, but you're onto something. I could go on and on about the economics of this, but the big problem right now is we've given too much power to the financial industry. It's called the financialization of everything. Kim Kardashian does a credit card. Basically everything, the financial industry has been given all power. And financial industry doesn't build. It acquires. It takes. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yeah. Roosevelt would understand the importance of the benefits, but also understand that we have to do something to protect the majority of the people in this country. He was pragmatic above all else. Hopefully I'll get to talk about Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Thank you.
Any questions? Thank you all so much for coming out on a Monday night. That is so good of you.